My water meter was spinning at 5 in the morning, and every valve on my property was supposed to be closed. I heard it before I saw it. That tiny plastic click, click, click inside the pump shed behind my greenhouse, soft enough to disappear under birdsong, but wrong enough to pull me out of bed before sunrise. Maple Creek Road was still dark, the kind of dark where porch lights glow yellow through mist and lawns look silver with dew. I stepped into the shed with a flashlight in one hand and my father's old brass hose nozzle in the other, not because I needed it, but because I had carried it for years the way some men carry a pocket knife. My father used to say water is honest if you measure it, inexpensive if you assume it. He taught me that while standing over irrigation trenches, showing me how a slow leak can steal more in a month than a broken pipe steals in a day. I am an irrigation contractor and a licensed backflow tester, so I know what a private line sounds like when it is sleeping. Mine was not sleeping. The pressure gauge was fluttering. The private irrigation meter was turning. The pump line had that low, strained hum of water moving somewhere it had not been asked to go. I checked the greenhouse first. Valves closed. Drip lines dry. Then the vegetable beds. Nothing. The orchard on the back half-acre. Nothing. The hose bib by the potting bench. Locked. The small service valve near the fence. Supposed to be locked. I shined the flashlight through the gap in the cedar boards toward Greenhaven Meadows, the neighborhood that sat beyond my rear property line. All white fences, trimmed hedges, and perfect spring banners advertising the annual Tulip show. Their flower beds were lit by landscape lamps, and the soil around thousands of tulips was dark, glossy, soaked like someone had watered for hours. The HOA irrigation heads were not running. No sprinklers clicked. No official watering schedule should have started until 7. But behind the tulip beds, near the old access panel where my private irrigation line ran parallel to the fence, the grass was pressed down in a narrow trail. I smelled wet mulch, tulip fertilizer, and that metallic smell of water. Under pressure. Then I saw the hose. Not all of it, just a black curve disappearing behind the panel, tucked low like whoever placed it thought darkness was the same thing as permission. My bill had been climbing for 3 weeks. My pressure had dropped every morning. My greenhouse starts had wilted twice because the line lost volume before sunrise. And every time I mentioned it to Patricia Ellsworth, president of Greenhaven Meadows Homeowners Association, she gave me that polished smile and said, "Caleb, your line runs along our landscape corridor. We all benefit from beauty." Beauty. That was what she called my meter turning while I slept. That was what she called private water disappearing into her tulip show. I lifted my phone and started recording the gauge, the spinning meter, the closed valves, the dry greenhouse lines, and the wet tulip beds glowing blue-white under the landscape lights beyond the fence. I did not touch the hose. I did not open the panel. I did not yell across the property line. My father's brass nozzle felt cold in my hand, worn smooth from decades of work, and I could hear his voice as clearly as the clicking meter. Do not assume, measure. So I measured. I wrote down the time, 5:06 in the morning. I filmed the pressure drop. I took still photos of the meter reading. Then, through the fence, I saw a white golf cart roll slowly between the tulip beds, and Patricia Ellsworth stepped out in a pale jacket, holding a clipboard like she was inspecting a miracle she had paid for. She bent toward the hidden access panel, checked the hose, and smiled at the flowers. That was the moment I knew I was not looking at a leak. I was looking at theft dressed up as landscaping. By 6 that morning, I had 3 videos, 12 photos, and a meter log that already told a better story than any argument I could have had over the fence. I stood inside the pump shed with the door open to the gray dawn, listening to the private irrigation line pull water toward Greenhaven Meadows while my own greenhouse sat dry behind me. The brass hose nozzle from my father rested on the workbench beside my clipboard, its worn metal catching the first pale stripe of sunlight through the dusty window. That nozzle had been on every job truck he ever owned, clipped to 5-gallon buckets, dropped in trenches, left on tailgates, and used to teach me the first rule of water work. Follow the flow before you follow the blame. So I followed it on paper. Meter reading at 5:06. Pressure drop from 62 pounds per square inch to 41. Greenhouse valve closed. Orchard valve closed. North bed valve closed. Hose bib locked. Pump cycling every 4 minutes with no demand from my side. On the other side of the fence, Patricia's tulip beds looked like a postcard being watered with somebody else's signature. Thousands of red, yellow, and purple blooms stood in perfect rows beneath little landscape lights, the soil around them dark and rich, while my seed trays waited for the morning cycle that never came. The annual Tulip show was Patricia Ellsworth's crown jewel. She had built half her reputation on it, sending glossy newsletters every spring, inviting local garden clubs, selling sponsor plaques, and calling the flower beds the heart of Greenhaven Meadows. This year, the city had increased irrigation rates, and the HOA system had been put on a reduced schedule because their pressure booster needed repairs. Patricia had mentioned it to me 3 weeks earlier at the mailbox cluster, smiling as if she were asking for a cup of sugar. "Caleb, your line runs so close to our landscape corridor," she said. "Surely a little temporary access for community beautification would not hurt." I told her no. I told her my line was private, metered, backflow protected, and tied to my greenhouse and orchard. I told her there was no shared water agreement, no easement, no permission, and no safe way for her landscapers to touch anything behind my fence. She smiled anyway. "You contractors always make simple things sound complicated." Now, looking at my spinning meter, I could see what she had done with simple. I called my sister Megan first because she had a better memory for dates than any spreadsheet and a talent for turning chaos into a timeline. She answered half asleep, and I said, "My irrigation meter is moving with everything off, and Patricia is watering tulips." That woke her up. "Do not touch the connection." I have not. "Do not shut anything off until you have the readings logged." Already logging. Send me the videos. I will pull the water bills and camera clips. My rear camera had been watching the fence line for years, mostly for deer, stray dogs, and delivery drivers who thought the service lane was a shortcut. By 7, Megan found the first clip. 3 mornings earlier, at 4:58, Greenhaven's landscaper, Lance Porter, rolled a hose cart along the tulip beds and stopped near the old access panel. At 5:02, Patricia arrived in her white golf cart. At 5:07, my pump shed camera caught the pressure gauge fluttering. Megan sent the clip with one sentence: "This is not a leak." I watched it twice, then looked through the fence again. Patricia was walking between tulips, touching petals like she had grown them from praise. My father's nozzle lay heavy in my palm. Water is honest if you measure it. By breakfast, I had measured enough to know the line was talking. Now I needed officials to hear it. I did not call Patricia because people who take water at 5 in the morning do not confess better at 8. I called attorney Rachel Donovan, then County Water Inspector Harold Briggs, then an independent plumber named Dean Collins, in that order, because the only thing stronger than a suspicion is a chain of people who can verify it without caring about the tulip show. Rachel answered from her car, and I could hear turn signal clicks between her sentences while I summarized the meter readings, pressure drops, fence camera clips, and Patricia's earlier request for temporary access. "Do not open the panel yourself," she said. "Do not touch the hose. Do not shut off anything that could let them claim you caused damage. Preserve the condition exactly as it is until inspection." That was hard, because every few minutes the pump cycled again, and every cycle sounded like coins falling out of my pocket into Patricia's flower beds. Megan arrived at 9 with coffee, a laptop, and the kind of expression that meant she had already built half the timeline in her head. We sat in the pump shed with the door open, the smell of damp concrete, irrigation pipe, potting soil, and spring air wrapped around us. She spread the water bills across the workbench beside my father's brass nozzle. March had been normal. Early April had climbed. The last 2 weeks looked ridiculous, especially between 4:45 and 6:15 in the morning, when my greenhouse was scheduled off and Greenhaven's reduced watering schedule should have been silent. Megan highlighted the numbers. "She is using your line when nobody is awake enough to notice." I noticed. "Because Dad taught you to listen to plumbing like other people listen to weather." I almost smiled. At 10:30, Harold Briggs pulled into my driveway in a county water department truck, followed by Dean Collins in a white plumbing van with pipe wrenches painted on the door. Harold was 60, square-shouldered, and moved slowly in a way that told you he had spent years watching people talk themselves into trouble. Dean had worked with me on commercial irrigation jobs, and he knew my system well enough to trust the map before the rumors. We started at the meter. Harold photographed the reading, watched the dial creep while all visible valves were closed, inspected the backflow preventer, checked the private irrigation line tag, then asked for my as-built drawing. I handed him the laminated copy from the wall. He traced the line with one finger until it reached the fence. Any recorded easement for the association? No. Any shared water agreement? No. Any permission granted verbally or in writing? No. I refused a request 3 weeks ago. Megan pulled up the email on her laptop. Patricia's words looked so polite on screen. Temporary community beautification access. My reply was shorter. No access, no connection, no shared use. Harold read it once and nodded. Clear enough. Then we walked the fence line. The grass near the old access panel was pressed flat, and the soil around it was damp even though my side had not run a cycle. Dean crouched without touching the panel and pointed at a small fresh scrape on one screw head. Somebody opened this recently. Harold took another photo. Across the fence, Tulip volunteers were setting up ribbon stands, little signs, and white folding tables for the weekend show. Patricia saw us then. She came over in a pale green blazer, clipboard hugged to her chest, her smile already prepared. "Caleb," she called, "is there some issue?" Harold answered before I could. "County water inspection. We are reviewing a private irrigation meter anomaly." Her smile did not disappear. It tightened. "I hope he is not trying to interfere with community landscaping." Rachel's voice came through my phone on speaker, calm as a closed gate. "Mrs. Ellsworth, this is attorney Rachel Donovan. No one from Greenhaven Meadows is authorized to touch, connect to, draw from, modify, or access Mr. Mercer's private irrigation line." Patricia blinked toward the phone. "That line runs along our landscape corridor." Harold looked up from the panel. "A corridor is not a water right." Dean stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and added softly, "And pressure does not drop by itself." Patricia looked past us at the tulips, then at the meter shed, then at my father's brass nozzle on the workbench through the open door. For the first time, she seemed to understand that I was not asking where my water went. I was preparing to make the line answer in public. Harold Briggs did not open the access panel until he had photographed the screws, the damp soil, the flattened grass, the hose curve visible beneath the fence gap, and the meter reading still creeping forward with every slow pulse of the pump. That was the thing about water cases. If you touched the evidence too early, everybody later claimed the condition had changed. So we waited while Harold made the morning boring, official, and impossible to rewrite. Dean Collins stood beside him with a flashlight angled low against the panel seam, and Megan typed notes from the workbench inside the pump shed, where my father's brass hose nozzle lay next to the printed bills like a small piece of history listening in. Patricia stayed on her side of the fence, pale green blazer bright against the tulips, her clipboard held tighter every time Harold took another picture. "This is extremely disruptive," she said. "We have volunteers arriving all day." Rachel's voice came through my phone again. "County inspection of a private utility line is not disruption, Mrs. Ellsworth. Unauthorized connection would be." Patricia looked toward the flower beds, where a row of Tulip committee signs leaned against a white folding table. The show was 2 days away. Banners were already hung along the walking path. Greenhaven Meadows had spent months selling the image of perfect spring color, perfect landscaping, perfect community pride. And behind all that perfection, my meter had been turning before dawn. When Harold finally removed the panel cover, he did it with gloves and set the screws on a clean cloth. Inside was a connection that had no business being there. A short hose adapter tied into the old service stub, fresh thread tape on the fitting, black hose running under the fence toward the tulip beds. Dean leaned closer, careful not to disturb it. "This was not here when I serviced Caleb's backflow device last fall." Harold photographed the adapter from 3 angles. "Is this association equipment?" Patricia answered too quickly. "I would have to ask landscaping." "Who authorized landscaping to connect to this line?" Rachel asked. "I am not a plumber," Patricia said. "I rely on vendors." That was the first time Lance Porter's name entered the record. He came around the end of the tulip bed 10 minutes later in a Greenhaven maintenance shirt, pushing an empty hose cart, and stopped when he saw the county truck. His face did what Patricia's had not. It told the truth before his mouth tried to catch up. Harold asked him who installed the adapter. Lance looked at Patricia, then at me, then at the panel. "I was told it was a community access point." "By whom?" Harold asked. Patricia stepped forward. "This conversation should go through the board." Lance swallowed. "Mrs. Ellsworth told me the homeowner had refused formal access, but that the line served the landscape corridor and we could use the old stub until the booster pump was repaired. The wind moved through the tulips, soft and colorful and suddenly irrelevant. Megan stopped typing for half a second, then started again. Faster. Harold closed the panel without disconnecting anything and placed a temporary county inspection tag on it. No further use of this connection, he said. No modification, no removal, no concealment. I will issue a written finding today. Patricia's voice hardened. Those flowers are for the community. I looked through the fence at the wet soil, the hidden hose, the perfect rose blooming on my bill. Then the community can water them with community water. Rachel sent the certified notice before noon. No access, no connection, no drawing water, no touching the panel, no retaliation. Preserve all emails, invoices, work orders, watering schedules, vendor messages, and Tulip Committee records. By 3, Patricia replied to the entire Greenhaven board, calling the inspection a hostile interference with a beloved community event. By 4, Evelyn Harper, a Tulip Committee volunteer, forwarded Megan an internal email from Patricia that read, "Use the Mercer sideline only before sunrise and keep volunteers away from the fence." I printed it, placed it beside my father's brass nozzle, and felt the case change shape. We no longer had to prove where the water went. We had to prove who kept sending it there after being told to stop. That evening, the pump shed became quieter than a courtroom before the judge walks in. Megan sat on an overturned bucket with her laptop balanced on her knees, building the timeline from every angle. The water bills, the pressure logs, the 458 camera clip, Harold's inspection photos, Lance's statement, Rachel's certified notice, and Evelyn Harper's forwarded email telling the Tulip Committee to keep volunteers away from the fence. I stood at the workbench with my father's brass nozzle in my hand and watched the private irrigation meter sit still for the first time all day because Harold's inspection tag had frozen the connection better than any padlock could have. Across the fence, Greenhaven Meadows still looked ready for a magazine cover. Tulips in perfect rows. White tent frames stacked near the path. Ribbon stands leaning beside sponsor signs. Patricia had built an entire weekend around those flowers, and now every petal seemed to be standing on a question she did not want answered out loud. At 7:15, Rachel called with Harold on the line. His written finding was ready. The irrigation line was private, the meter was tied to my account, the backflow device was certified, no association easement existed, no shared water agreement existed, and the adapter inside the access panel was not part of my approved system. "That gives us the line," Rachel said. "Now we need the path." Dean Collins had already been thinking the same thing. He arrived at sunrise the next morning with a sealed case of non-toxic blue plumbing tracer dye, sterile salinity test strips, clean sample bottles, and a temporary test tank no bigger than a storage cooler, the kind we use on commercial irrigation jobs when we need to prove where non-potable water is moving without touching drinking water. Before anyone opened anything, Harold returned and watched Dean isolate the test setup from the potable supply. The backflow preventer was locked. The main private line was closed. The temporary tank was connected only to the isolated irrigation test branch that had been feeding the old service stub. Dean labeled every hose in block letters. Test water. Non-potable. Do not connect. Rachel had me film the labels, the closed valves, the meter reading, the lock on the backflow device. The product sheet showing the dye was made for plumbing tracing, and Harold confirming on camera that the test was confined to non-potable irrigation equipment on my side of the property. This was not poison. It was not sabotage. It was a flashlight for water. The salt was not a weapon either. Dean mixed a controlled brackish marker into the test tank at a measurable level, enough for salinity strips to identify the source if it appeared somewhere it should not enough to turn the yard into anything dangerous. Every step went into the record because I knew Patricia would call anything blue contamination if she thought the word sounded useful. By 8:30, the test tank was filled, capped, labeled, and sitting inside my pump shed under camera view. Dean opened the isolated test valve for exactly 3 minutes, then closed it and wrote down the starting volume. Nothing moved on my property. No greenhouse line opened. No orchard drip ran. No sprinkler head rose. The tank level dropped anyway. Somewhere beyond the fence, water was being pulled through the hidden connection Harold had ordered untouched for evidence. Megan's eyes lifted from the gauge to mine. There it is. I looked through the cedar boards at the tulip beds, where Patricia's volunteers were tying ribbons onto white posts and pretending the weekend was still about flowers. My father's brass nozzle sat on the workbench beside the sample bottles, dull and steady in the morning light. Water is honest if you measure it. By 9, we had measured enough. Now all we had to do was wait for the tulips to tell the truth. The tulip show opened under a sky so clear it looked rehearsed, and for the first hour Patricia Ellsworth looked like a woman standing inside her own brochure. Greenhaven Meadows had white tents along the walking path, sponsor signs near the flower beds, a ribbon arch by the fountain, and volunteers in pale green shirts handing out programs that called the tulips a celebration of community care. From my side of the fence, inside the pump shed, the scene sounded like polite music, golf cart tires on pavement, paper cups being stacked, and people saying beautiful before they had any idea what beauty had cost. Megan sat beside the laptop watching the fence camera feed. Dean Collins checked the test tank level every 15 minutes. Harold Briggs stood with a county clipboard near the shed door, not blocking anything, not making a scene, just waiting for water to finish telling the truth. At 9:41, the first blue tint appeared in the drainage gravel beneath the tulip bed closest to the old access panel. It was faint at first, a pale blue thread moving through wet mulch, easy to miss if you were admiring flowers instead of following flow. Dean saw it before anyone else. "There," he said quietly. I lifted the camera and zoomed through the fence. The tulips were still upright, bright and beautiful, but the soil around their roots carried blue streaks like a map being drawn in public. Harold took a sample bottle from his kit, walked to the common side by permission through the maintenance gate with Dean and a Greenhaven board member as witnesses, and collected runoff from the lowest point of the bed. Dean dipped the first salinity strip. The color changed almost immediately. He compared it to the control sample from our test tank, then to tap water, then to the soil runoff again. Match. Not close enough for gossip. Close enough for a report. Megan whispered, "It is the tank." I looked at my father's brass nozzle on the workbench, dull in the shade, and felt the kind of satisfaction that does not need a smile. At 10:03, the rear camera caught Lance Porter behind the tulip arch, crouching near the panel with his hose cart tucked between two hedges. The county tag was still visible. Rachel's certified notice had been delivered the day before. Lance looked around, lifted the panel just enough to reach inside, and opened the connection. The test tank level inside my shed dropped another half-inch. The blue runoff deepened around the tulips. Then Patricia saw it. She was standing near the ribbon arch with a microphone, ready to welcome a local garden club, when a volunteer pointed down at the mulch. Patricia followed the gesture, and her smile folded inward. Blue water had collected along the edge of the bed, not dramatic, not dangerous, just unmistakable. A child said, "Why is the dirt blue?" And half the adults turned at once. Patricia's eyes moved from the flower bed to the fence line, then to my pump shed where Harold was writing on his clipboard. She crossed the grass fast, voice already sharpened. "Caleb, what have you done?" I stayed on my side of the fence. "A county witness tracer test on my private non-potable irrigation branch. You contaminated our tulip show." Harold stepped forward before I answered. "Mrs. Ellsworth, the tracer appears in your bed only if water from his isolated test line was drawn through the unauthorized connection after notice." She looked at Lance. Lance looked at the hose cart. The microphone near the ribbon arch was still live enough to carry the silence. Deputy Alan Pierce arrived at 10:26, just as Patricia was, trying to turn blue water into a public emergency and the tulip show into a crime scene with herself at the center. His patrol vehicle rolled past the sponsor signs and stopped near the maintenance gate, where visitors had begun drifting away from the ribbon arch and gathering in little confused circles. The tulips were still standing, bright rows of red, yellow, and purple under the morning sun, but the pale blue runoff around the closest bed had changed the mood completely. People were no longer looking at flowers. They were looking at the fence, the access panel, the hose cart, and Patricia, who had one hand wrapped around the microphone like it could still make her version louder than the evidence. "Deputy," she said before he had both feet on the grass, "this homeowner intentionally interfered with a community event by putting foreign material into our irrigation." Deputy Pierce looked first at Harold Briggs, then at me, then at the blue-streaked mulch. "Is anyone hurt?" "No," Harold said. The material is non-toxic plumbing tracer dye used in a county-witnessed irrigation test on Mr. Mercer's private non-potable line. Patricia snapped. That is his claim. Harold lifted his clipboard. It is my observation. That slowed her down for half a breath. I stayed on my side of the fence with Megan beside me, my phone recording, my father's brass nozzle visible on the pump shed bench behind us. Rachel Donovan had already joined by speakerphone, and her voice stayed calm enough to cut through the chatter. Deputy Pierce, my client's private irrigation line was inspected yesterday. Written notice was delivered prohibiting Greenhaven Meadows from touching or drawing from that line. The test setup was isolated, labeled, and witnessed. Deputy Pierce nodded toward Harold. Can I see the connection? Harold led him to the access panel, where Dean Collins stood with sample bottles, salinity strips, and the printed product sheet. The county tag was still attached. The hidden hose was still connected. The panel had fresh movement marks from Lance opening it less than 30 minutes earlier. Dean showed the test tank video on his phone. Closed potable supply, locked. Backflow preventer, non-potable test branch, labels, starting volume, blue tracer added, controlled salinity marker, and the tank level dropping while no irrigation ran on my property. Then Megan played the camera clip. Lance crouched behind the Tulip arch, lifted the tagged panel, reached inside, opened the connection, and looked back toward Patricia before stepping away. Deputy Pierce watched it twice. Lance was standing near the hose cart now, face pale under his Greenhaven cap. Mr. Porter, the deputy said, were you instructed to use this connection after notice was given? Lance swallowed. Patricia said, do not answer without board counsel. Deputy Pierce turned to her. Ma'am, I asked him. The microphone at the ribbon arch had finally been turned off, but the crowd was close enough to hear anyway. Lance looked at the Tulip beds, then at the access panel, then at me. I was told to keep using the Mercer side line until the show was over. Patricia's jaw set hard. That is not accurate. Lance shook his head slowly. You told me before sunrise only, and if anyone asked, call it corridor irrigation. The words landed over the tulips like shade. Deputy Pierce wrote them down. Then he looked at Patricia and asked the question that ended the performance. Why was your landscaper connected to his private line after written notice? She opened her mouth, but for once no polished phrase came out fast enough. Community beauty did not answer it. Landscape corridor did not answer it. Temporary use did not answer it. The blue water in the mulch answered it better than she could. By noon, the tulip show had stopped pretending it was about tulips. The white tents still stood along the walking path. The sponsor signs still leaned in the grass, and the flowers still lifted their colors into the bright spring air, but every conversation had moved toward the blue runoff, the hidden hose, and the question Patricia could not answer. Deputy Pierce did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He took statements from Harold Briggs, Dean Collins, Lance Porter, Megan, and me, then photographed the panel, the hose adapter, the county tag, the sample bottles, the salinity strips, and the test tank labels inside my pump shed. Patricia kept repeating that Greenhaven Meadows had acted for community beautification, as if saying the word community enough times could turn my meter into a public fountain. Rachel stayed on speakerphone while I stood beside the pump shed door with my father's brass nozzle resting on the workbench behind me. Deputy, she said, we are requesting that the connection remain documented and that no Greenhaven representative touch the private line or the access panel until the county completes its report. Harold nodded. Agreed. I am issuing a written directive today. Patricia's face tightened. You cannot shut down our irrigation 2 days before the busiest show weekend of the year. Harold looked at the tulip beds, then at the hose disappearing toward my fence. I am not shutting down your irrigation. I am stopping unauthorized use of his. That sentence traveled through the visitors faster than any announcement Patricia had planned. Evelyn Harper, still wearing her volunteer badge, walked over with a folder tucked under one arm and looked at me with the embarrassed sadness of someone realizing she had helped decorate a lie. I have the committee emails, she said quietly. The invoices too. We were told the emergency water line was approved. Megan took the folder like it was glass. Inside were Tulip committee schedules, vendor notes, and a budget line marked supplemental irrigation support. One email from Patricia stood out immediately. Keep early watering discreet until booster repair is complete. Avoid discussing Mercer access with general volunteers. I read it once. then handed it to Rachel through the camera so she could see the wording. "That goes into the demand packet," she said. "All of it." By 3 o'clock, Patricia had sent a message to the Greenhaven board calling the tracer test a hostile act against a community event. By 3:15, Rachel replied with Harold's preliminary finding, Lance's statement summary, the certified notice, the product sheet, the test setup video, and the camera clip of Lance opening the tag panel after notice. By 4, the management company requested an emergency meeting at the clubhouse that evening. Patricia wanted it closed. Rachel said no. The issue involved association funds, board authority, private utility access, vendor instruction, and potential reimbursement, and residents had a right to know why the Tulip show had been watered through a line they did not own. At 6:30, I locked the pump shed for the first time that day. The meter was still. The pressure gauge sat steady. The greenhouse finally ran its own cycle, a clean hiss through the drip lines, and the smell of wet tomato starts filled the air behind me. Across the fence, the tulip beds were still beautiful, but now the lowest mulch carried faint blue traces like the ground itself had signed the report. I picked up my father's brass nozzle, wiped a spot of dust from the threads, and placed it in my jacket pocket before heading to the clubhouse. Patricia had built a whole festival on borrowed pressure. Tonight, every gallon was going to be counted. The clubhouse was packed before 7, and the room smelled like wet mulch, coffee, printer paper, and the kind of nervous politeness people bring when a neighborhood celebration turns into a utility investigation. Greenhaven Meadows had decorated the walls with tulip photographs for the weekend event, red and yellow blooms printed on glossy posters, but every eye in the room kept drifting to the projector screen where Megan had already placed the first slide. My private irrigation meter at 5:06 in the morning, spinning while every valve on my property was closed. Patricia sat at the board table in a cream blazer with her clipboard flat in front of her, no microphone in her hand this time, no ribbon ceremony smile left on her face. I sat with Rachel Donovan on one side and Megan on the other, my father's brass nozzle resting on the table beside the printed timeline. Rachel began with the line map. Private irrigation meter. Private backflow device. Private pump shed. No association easement. No shared water agreement. No permission. Then she showed Harold Briggs's county finding, the certified notice, the inspection tag on the access panel, and the hidden adapter inside the old service stub. Patricia leaned forward. This was an emergency landscape support issue during a major community event. Rachel did not look at her. She clicked to the next slide. Patricia's own email. Use the Mercer sideline only before sunrise and keep volunteers away from the fence. The room went quiet in a way no microphone could improve. Evelyn Harper stood near the front with her volunteer badge still pinned to her shirt, and when Rachel asked where the committee believed the supplemental irrigation came from, Evelyn's voice shook but stayed clear. We were told it was approved temporary access. We were not told Mr. Mercer had refused permission. Then came Lance Porter's clip, the hose cart, the tag panel, his hand opening the connection after written notice. Then the test tank video, labels, non-potable setup, locked backflow preventer, blue plumbing tracer, salinity marker, closed valves, camera angle, starting volume. Then the footage from the tulip bed, pale blue runoff threading through the mulch, while Patricia stood with a ribbon behind her. A board member named Carl Whitman rubbed both hands over his face and asked the question everyone had been circling. How much water are we talking about? Megan stood and read the numbers from the spreadsheet. 3 weeks of abnormal meter movement, early morning pressure drops, estimated gallons based on meter readings, increased utility costs, greenhouse losses from low pressure, inspection fees, plumbing verification, backflow recertification, attorney notices, and the test setup. Every number landed harder than the last because they were not dramatic. They were measured. Patricia tried one more time. The Tulip show benefits the entire neighborhood. I picked up my father's brass nozzle and turned it once in my hand. Then the entire neighborhood should have paid for its own water. No one laughed. That made it stronger. Rachel gave the board our demands: reimbursement for the water taken, compensation for documented greenhouse impacts, legal fees, inspection costs, plumbing repair, backflow recertification, removal of the unauthorized adapter, a written correction to residents, preservation of all Tulip committee records, and a policy banning any board member or vendor from accessing private utility lines without written owner permission and documented easement rights. Patricia's face hardened at the word banning, but the room no longer belonged to her. Residents began asking questions she could not decorate. Who approved the vendor instruction? Why the booster repair had not been disclosed? Why their dues were used for a show while private water was being taken? Why volunteers were told to stay away from the fence? Harold stood from the back wall and said one sentence that ended the argument. A landscape corridor is not a water right. I looked at the Tulip posters on the walls, bright, cheerful, and suddenly hollow, and realized the flowers had never been the real show. The real show was watching a private line, a quiet meter, and a little blue water teach an entire room the difference between beauty and theft. The board accepted the settlement before the weekend ended, and by Monday morning the Tulip show signs were coming down while my pump shed finally sounded like itself again. No hidden pull, no pressure flutter, no little click of a meter paying for someone else's flowers before sunrise. Greenhaven Meadows reimbursed every documented gallon, the increased utility charges, the greenhouse losses, the inspection fees, the plumbing verification, the removal of the unauthorized adapter, the backflow recertification, and Rachel's legal costs. They also issued a written correction to every resident stating that my irrigation line was private, metered, monitored, and never available for association use without written permission, recorded easement rights, and direct owner authorization. Patricia Ellsworth was removed from the landscaping committee first, then resigned as HOA president 3 days later after Lance's written statement and Evelyn's committee emails became part of the record. The announcement called it a transition for the good of the community. Megan read that phrase aloud at my kitchen table and shook her head. That is what they call it when the water finally reaches the truth. I kept the corrected notice in the pump shed folder, right behind Harold Briggs's county finding and Dean Collins's test report. The hidden adapter was removed under county supervision. The old access panel was sealed with a locking cover. Dean pressure tested the line from the meter to the greenhouse, recertified the backflow preventer, and handed me a clean report that felt better than any apology Patricia could have given. The tulips survived. That mattered to me more than people probably expected. I never wanted to ruin flowers. I wanted to prove who was stealing the water that fed them. For a few days, faint blue traces still showed in the lowest mulch after rain. Not enough to scare anybody, just enough to remind the neighborhood that beauty built on someone else's meter leaves a mark. I mounted a small metal sign on the pump shed door, private water. Metered. Monitored. No HOA access. Below it, I hung my father's brass hose nozzle on a hook beside the pressure gauge. It looked right there, worn and dull and honest, close to the line it had helped me defend. A week later, Evelyn Harper stopped by with a folder of revised Tulip Committee procedures and a quiet thank you. The new board had required written source verification for every water supply, every vendor connection, and every landscape expense. They had also approved a public budget note explaining the booster pump repair they should have handled in the first place. Across the fence, Greenhaven's tulip beds were still colorful, but now they were watered from their own system, on their own schedule, at their own cost. At 5:06 the next morning, I walked into the pump shed just to listen. The meter was still. The pressure gauge sat steady at 62 pounds per square inch. The greenhouse drip cycle had not started yet. Outside, my tomato starts waited in clean dark soil, and the orchard leaves moved softly in the dawn air. I picked up the brass nozzle, turned it once in my hand, and thought about my father's rule. Water is honest if you measure it. Patricia had counted on darkness, flowers, and polite words to hide a stolen flow. But meters remember. Pressure remembers. Cameras remember. And sometimes justice does not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it runs clear through the right line, turns blue exactly where the light connects, and stops only when the person paying for it finally closes the valve.